She knocked on the mansion's door asking for farm work, but had no idea the millionaire owner would discover something that would change both their lives forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling Willowbrook estate as Elena Martinez approached the ornate iron gates that separated her world from one she had only dreamed of entering. Her weathered shoes crunched softly against the pristine gravel driveway as she clutched the newspaper clipping that had brought her here, a small advertisement seeking farm workers that represented her last hope. Elena had traveled for hours on 3 different buses to reach this place, spending her final dollars on transportation while her stomach reminded her that she hadn't eaten since the previous evening. The elegant mansion loomed before her like something from a fairy tale, its pristine white columns and manicured gardens a stark contrast to the rundown neighborhoods she had called home her entire life. Standing before the massive oak doors, Elena hesitated. The brass knocker seemed too grand for someone like her to touch, but desperation has a way of making even the most intimidated find courage. She lifted her trembling hand and knocked 3 times, each sound echoing like thunder in her ears. The door opened to reveal Margaret Thompson, the estate's head housekeeper, whose kind eyes immediately took in Elena's modest appearance and nervous demeanor. Margaret had worked at Willowbrook Estate for decades and had developed an instinct for reading people's character beyond their circumstances. "Good morning, dear," Margaret said gently, noticing how Elena instinctively stepped back, as if afraid she didn't belong. "How may I help you?" Elena cleared her throat, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "I'm here about the farm worker position advertised in the newspaper. I know I should have called first, but I don't have a phone, and I was hoping—" Her words trailed off as heavy footsteps approached from behind Margaret. Richard Blackwood appeared in the doorway, his expensive suit and commanding presence making Elena feel even smaller than before. Richard was a self-made millionaire who had built his fortune through determination and shrewd business decisions. But success had also made him skeptical of people's motives. "Margaret, what's going on here?" Richard's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having his questions answered immediately. "This young lady is inquiring about the farm position, sir," Margaret replied, stepping aside slightly. Richard's eyes swept over Elena, taking in her worn clothing and nervous posture. In his experience, people who showed up unannounced were usually looking for handouts or had something to hide. The estate attracted all kinds of individuals with schemes and sob stories, and he had learned to be cautious. "The position requires experience with livestock and agricultural equipment," Richard said curtly. "Do you have any relevant background?" Elena straightened her shoulders, drawing upon every ounce of dignity she possessed. "I grew up helping my grandfather on his small farm before he passed away. I know how to care for animals, maintain gardens, and I'm not afraid of hard work. A small family farm is hardly preparation for managing a commercial operation like ours," Richard replied dismissively. "We need someone with professional experience and references." The rejection hit Elena like a physical blow, but she refused to give up. Too much depended on finding work, not just for herself, but for the family members counting on her back home. Her younger siblings needed food, and her mother's medical bills continued to pile up despite Elena's best efforts to keep up with payments. "Please, sir," Elena said, her voice steady despite the desperation churning in her stomach. "I'll work for a trial period without pay, just to prove myself. I promise I won't disappoint you." Richard was about to dismiss her completely when something in her eyes made him pause. He had built his success by recognizing potential where others saw only limitations, and despite his initial skepticism, something about Elena's determination reminded him of his own younger self when he had nothing but ambition and willpower. Margaret, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward. "Perhaps Mr. Sullivan could evaluate her abilities? We are short-staffed for the harvest season." James Sullivan, the farm manager, had just finished his morning rounds and was approaching the main house when he overheard the conversation. James was a practical man who valued work ethic over appearances, having started as a farmhand himself decades earlier. "What kind of experience do you have with crop rotation and soil management?" James asked Elena directly, his weathered face serious but not unkind. Elena's response surprised everyone present. She spoke knowledgeably about sustainable farming practices, demonstrating an understanding that went far beyond casual familiarity. Her grandfather had been progressive in his methods, and Elena had absorbed lessons that many formerly trained agriculturalists might miss. "Interesting," James murmured, exchanging a meaningful glance with Margaret. "She knows what she's talking about." Richard found himself reconsidering his hasty judgment. Perhaps there was more to this young woman than her modest appearance suggested. However, his business instinct still urged caution. Too many people had tried to take advantage of his success over the years. "Very well," Richard said finally. "You can have a week's trial. James will supervise your work and evaluate your performance. But understand this, if you can't meet our standards, you'll need to find employment elsewhere." Eleanor's face lit up with gratitude that was impossible to fake. "Thank you so much, Mr. Blackwood. You won't regret this decision." As Margaret led Elena toward the staff quarters to get settled, Richard watched from his study window. Something about the young woman's story didn't add up, and he made a mental note to have his assistant conduct a background check. In his experience, people who appeared too good to be true usually were. What Richard didn't know was that Elena carried secrets that would challenge everything he thought he knew about judging people by their circumstances. Hidden beneath her humble exterior lay talents and experiences that would soon turn his perfectly ordered world upside down. The stage was set for a collision between two worlds that seemed impossibly different, yet would soon discover they shared more common ground than either could have imagined. Elena's arrival at Willowbrook Estate marked the beginning of a journey that would transform not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her in ways none of them could possibly predict. The staff quarters at Willowbrook Estate were modest but clean, a stark contrast to the opulent main house. Elena sat on the narrow bed that would be her home for the next week, unpacking the few belongings she had brought in a worn canvas bag. Each item told a story of struggle, a photograph of her family, a small notebook filled with her grandfather's farming wisdom, and a letter she kept close to her heart. As dawn broke over the estate, Elena made her way to the main barn, where James Sullivan was already preparing for the day's work. The morning air carried the sweet scent of hay and the distant sound of cattle, reminding her of happier times on her grandfather's farm. "You're early," James observed, noting Elena's punctuality with approval. "That's a good sign. Today we'll see what you're really made of." James led her through the extensive farm operations, explaining the sophisticated systems that kept Willowbrook Estate running like clockwork. The scale was overwhelming. Hundreds of acres of crops, prize-winning livestock, and equipment worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. "This isn't like the small farms you might be used to," James warned as they approached a massive greenhouse complex. "We supply restaurants and specialty markets across 3 states. One mistake can cost thousands." Elena nodded, absorbing every detail. However, as they toured the facilities, she noticed several concerning issues that the experienced farm manager seemed to have overlooked. Plants in one section showed early signs of nutrient deficiency, and the irrigation system appeared to be distributing water unevenly. "Mr. Sullivan," Elena said hesitantly, "I noticed some of the tomato plants in Greenhouse 3 seem to be developing yellow spotting on their lower leaves." James stopped and looked at her sharply. "What are you suggesting?" "It could be early blight or possibly a magnesium deficiency. My grandfather taught me to recognize the signs before they become serious problems." James walked back to examine the plants Elena had indicated. His expression grew troubled as he realized she was absolutely right. Issues he had been too busy to notice were clearly visible once pointed out. "How did you spot this so quickly?" James asked, his tone shifting from skepticism to genuine curiosity. Elena's knowledge seemed to extend far beyond basic farm work. She identified optimal harvesting times for different crops, suggested improvements to storage methods, and demonstrated an understanding of sustainable farming practices that impressed even the seasoned farm manager. Word of Elena's observations reached the main house faster than she anticipated. Thomas Carter, the head groundskeeper who had worked at the estate for over 2 decades, was not pleased to hear that a newcomer was making suggestions about operations he considered his domain. "Who does she think she is?" Thomas grumbled to Sarah Mitchell as they prepared the morning refreshments for Richard's business meeting. "Coming here and acting like she knows more than people who've been doing this job since before she was born." Sarah, who managed the kitchen staff with military precision, shared Thomas's skepticism. "Mr. Blackwood should have done more background checking before letting her stay here. We don't know anything about her real motives." Their conversation was interrupted when David Harrison arrived for his scheduled meeting with Richard. David was Richard's longtime business partner and closest friend, someone who had known him since their college days, when both men had nothing but dreams and determination. "The estate looks magnificent as always," David commented as Margaret escorted him to Richard's study. "How's the new farm worker James mentioned?" Richard paused in reviewing his business documents. "She's only been here one day, but apparently she's already making quite an impression. James seems to think she has genuine expertise." "That's unusual for someone seeking basic farm work," David observed. "Most people with real agricultural knowledge end up in management positions or running their own operations." Richard had been thinking the same thing. Elena's background didn't match her apparent qualifications, and successful businessmen like Richard didn't achieve their position by ignoring inconsistencies. Meanwhile, Elena was working alongside the other farm workers, demonstrating a work ethic that earned grudging respect, even from those initially suspicious of her presence. She arrived early, stayed late, and tackled every task with dedication that was impossible to fake. During the lunch break, Elena sat alone under a large oak tree, reading from her grandfather's notebook while eating the simple meal Margaret had prepared. The other workers kept their distance, still uncertain about this newcomer who seemed to know too much for someone claiming basic farm experience. "That's an interesting book," a voice said behind her. Elena turned to find Richard approaching, having decided to observe his new employee firsthand rather than rely on second-hand reports. His business instincts told him that understanding Elena's true background was crucial to protecting his interests. "It belonged to my grandfather," Elena replied, quickly closing the notebook. "Just some old farming notes." Richard sat down on a nearby bench, his presence making Elena visibly nervous. "James tells me you identified potential problems that could have cost us significant losses. That's remarkable for someone with limited experience." Elena's cheeks flushed with embarrassment rather than pride. "I just noticed things my grandfather taught me to look for. He always said prevention was better than cure." "What kind of farm did your grandfather operate?" Richard pressed, sensing there was more to the story than Elena was revealing. "Just a small family farm," Elena answered carefully. "Nothing like this place." Richard studied her face, noting the way she avoided direct eye contact when discussing her background. In his business dealings, he had learned to recognize when people were hiding something important. "Elena," Richard said gently but firmly, "I need to ask you something directly. Are you being completely honest about your experience and qualifications?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her grandfather's notebook, knowing that her answer could determine whether she kept this opportunity or lost her last hope for supporting her family. "I haven't lied about anything," Elena said quietly, which was technically true but clearly not the complete truth. Richard sensed the evasion but decided not to push further for now. Something about Elena's situation reminded him of his own difficult beginnings, when he had sometimes bent the truth to get opportunities that seemed beyond his reach. "Very well," Richard said, standing to leave. "Continue working with James. Your trial period isn't over yet." As Richard walked back toward the main house, he made a mental note to have his assistant conduct a more thorough background investigation. Elena Martinez was hiding something significant, and Richard needed to know what it was before making any long-term decisions about her employment. Elena watched him go, her heart pounding with the knowledge that her carefully constructed story was beginning to unravel. She had hoped to prove herself through hard work before anyone discovered the truth about her past. But Richard Blackwood was clearly more perceptive than she had anticipated. The afternoon brought new challenges as Elena worked alongside Thomas Carter on maintaining the estate's elaborate garden systems. Thomas had decided to test the newcomer with increasingly difficult tasks, hoping to expose any weaknesses in her supposed expertise. "Think you can handle pruning these heritage roses without damaging them?" Thomas asked with barely concealed skepticism. "They're worth more than most people's cars." Elena approached the delicate plants with confidence that surprised Thomas. Her movements were precise and knowledgeable, demonstrating techniques that required years of experience to master properly. "Where did you learn to prune like that?" Thomas demanded, his suspicion growing with each expert cut Elena made. "My grandfather was very particular about proper plant care," Elena replied, focusing intently on her work to avoid Thomas's searching gaze. By evening, Word had spread throughout the estate staff that the new farm worker possessed skills that went far beyond basic agricultural knowledge. Some viewed her expertise with suspicion, wondering what secrets she might be hiding. Others began to respect her competence, regardless of her mysterious background. Elena returned to her quarters that night knowing that her time at Willowbrook Estate was becoming more complicated than she had anticipated. Richard Blackwood was clearly investigating her background, and it would only be a matter of time before he discovered the truth she had been so desperate to hide. The third morning at Willowbrook Estate brought an emergency that would change everything. Elena was awakened before dawn by frantic shouting from the direction of the main barn. She threw on her work clothes and rushed outside to find chaos erupting across the farm. "The prize bulls are sick," James Sullivan called out as he ran toward the livestock area. "Something's seriously wrong." Elena followed, her heart racing as she saw the estate's most valuable animals, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, displaying alarming symptoms. The magnificent Angus bulls that were the pride of Richard's breeding program were stumbling, refusing food, and showing signs of severe distress. Dr. Amanda Foster, the estate's veterinarian, had already arrived and was examining the animals with growing concern. Her years of experience treating elite livestock had never prepared her for a situation this dire affecting multiple animals simultaneously. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Foster muttered, checking vital signs. "It's not any disease I can immediately identify. We need to isolate them immediately before it spreads to the entire herd." Richard appeared at the barn entrance, his face pale as he surveyed the devastating scene. These bulls represented not just enormous financial investment, but decades of careful breeding and his reputation in the agricultural community. Losing them would be catastrophic on multiple levels. "What's causing this?" Richard demanded, his usual composure cracking under the pressure. "I'm running emergency blood tests, but results won't be available for hours," Dr. Foster replied grimly. "Whatever this is, it's progressing rapidly." Elena watched the chaos unfold, her mind racing as she observed the animals' specific symptoms. Something about their condition triggered a memory from her childhood, a devastating incident on her grandfather's farm that had nearly destroyed everything he had worked to build. "Dr. Foster," Elena said hesitantly, stepping forward despite knowing she risked overstepping her position as a trial farm worker. "Have you checked their water source recently?" The veterinarian looked up sharply. "Water contamination was one of my first thoughts, but the main water system tested clean yesterday." "What about the supplemental feeding stations?" Elena pressed, her voice growing more urgent. "Sometimes contaminated minerals or additives can cause these exact symptoms." James Sullivan frowned. "The feed supplements were delivered and installed just 2 days ago by our regular supplier, Greenfield Agricultural Supply. Same company we've used for years." Elena's expression grew troubled. "My grandfather once had a similar crisis. The supplement supplier had accidentally mixed industrial-grade additives meant for mining operations with livestock minerals. The symptoms were identical: disorientation, loss of appetite, and rapid deterioration." Dr. Foster paused her examination. "That's actually possible. Heavy metal contamination could explain the rapid onset and severity. But Greenfield has never made that kind of mistake," Richard protested, clinging to his faith in established business relationships. Elena felt the weight of everyone's skeptical stares, but the memory of her grandfather's near disaster compelled her to continue. "Sir, my grandfather lost 12 cattle before discovering the contamination. By the time symptoms appeared, the damage was already extensive. If this is the same thing, every hour matters." The urgency in Elena's voice cut through Richard's skepticism. He had built his fortune by recognizing when to trust unconventional advice, and something about Elena's conviction reminded him why he had achieved success where others failed. "Check the supplement stations," Richard ordered James. "Every single one." As the farm team scrambled to test the feeding supplements, Elena found herself alone with the sick animals. She knelt beside the largest bull, a magnificent creature named Thunder, who was the cornerstone of Richard's breeding program. The animal's labored breathing and confused movements broke her heart. "Hey there, beautiful," Elena whispered, gently stroking the bull's massive head. "We're going to figure this out." What happened next shocked everyone present. Thunder, who had been aggressively rejecting all human contact since falling ill, actually calmed under Elena's touch. His breathing became less labored, and he stopped the restless pacing that had been exhausting his remaining strength. Dr. Foster stopped her frantic preparations to stare. "I've never seen Thunder respond to anyone like that. He barely tolerates me, and I've been treating him for years." Elena continued her gentle ministrations, speaking softly to the distressed animal, while her mind raced with memories of her grandfather's teachings about animal behavior and emergency care. She had spent countless hours learning to read livestock emotions and provide comfort during medical crises. "Elena," Richard said quietly, approaching with an expression of growing amazement. "How did you know to check the supplements?" For a moment, Elena's carefully constructed story about being a simple farm worker threatened to crumble completely. The depth of her knowledge, her immediate recognition of rare symptoms, and her extraordinary connection with the animals revealed expertise that went far beyond basic farm experience. "My grandfather taught me that when multiple animals show identical symptoms simultaneously, it's usually environmental rather than infectious," Elena explained, her voice trembling with the effort to maintain her cover story. Lucas Reed, Richard's personal assistant, arrived at the barn carrying a tablet filled with urgent information. Lucas was known for his thorough research abilities and had been discreetly investigating Elena's background since Richard's request. "Sir," Lucas said urgently, "I have the preliminary results from Elena's background check, and there are some significant discrepancies that need immediate attention." Richard glanced between Lucas and Elena, sensing that revelations were coming that would change everything. However, before he could respond, James Sullivan came running back from the supplement testing area. "Elena was right," James shouted. "The new mineral supplements are contaminated with industrial chemicals. The supplier confirmed they accidentally shipped mining-grade additives instead of livestock supplements." The relief that washed over the group was palpable, but it was immediately followed by the realization of how much worse the disaster could have been. Without Elena's quick diagnosis, they might have lost the entire herd worth millions of dollars. Dr. Foster immediately began administering treatments for heavy metal poisoning, while Richard stood in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. A young woman he had reluctantly hired for a trial position had single-handedly prevented the destruction of his most valuable livestock operation. "Elena," Richard said slowly, "you just saved my entire breeding program. Do you understand what that means?" Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face as she continued comforting Thunder. But her tears weren't just from relief about the animals. They were from the crushing weight of knowing that her deception was about to be exposed. Lucas stepped closer to Richard, holding his tablet with information that would shatter Elena's carefully maintained facade. "Sir, about those background inconsistencies—" "Not now, Lucas," Richard said firmly, his attention completely focused on Elena. "Whatever you found can wait. This woman just performed a miracle." But Elena knew there would be no hiding from the truth much longer. Her extensive veterinary knowledge, her sophisticated understanding of agricultural operations, and her uncanny ability to diagnose rare livestock emergencies painted a picture of someone with far more training than she had claimed. As Thunder's breathing stabilized and the other bulls began responding to treatment, Elena realized that saving Richard's animals might have cost her the anonymity she had desperately needed to maintain. The secret she had been protecting, the real reason she was working as a simple farm laborer instead of pursuing her true calling, was about to be revealed whether she was ready or not. The morning that had begun with potential disaster was transforming into something even more dangerous for Elena, the moment when her past would collide with her present in ways that could destroy the new life she was trying to build. Dr. Foster approached Elena with obvious respect. "Where did you train in veterinary emergency response? That diagnosis was absolutely brilliant." Elena's heart sank as she realized that her expertise had betrayed her completely. The very knowledge that had saved Richard's fortune was about to expose the painful truth she had been running from. The tension in Richard's study was suffocating as Lucas Reed spread the contents of his investigation across the mahogany desk. Elena stood near the window, her hands trembling as she watched the farm workers outside caring for the recovering bulls she had saved just hours earlier. "Sir," Lucas began carefully, "Elena Martinez doesn't exist in any employment records prior to arriving here. No social security history, no previous addresses, and most concerning, no veterinary licensing under that name anywhere in the country. Richard's expression darkened as he processed this information. Are you suggesting she's using a false identity? The Elena Martinez who applied for work here has no paper trail, Lucas continued, pulling up documents on his tablet. However, I did find something interesting. There's a doctor, Elena Vasquez, who graduated top of her class from the prestigious Hartwell Veterinary Institute and was considered one of the most promising veterinary surgeons of her generation. Elena's knees nearly buckled as her worst fears materialized. The name she had abandoned was being spoken aloud in the very place she had hoped to find refuge. Dr. Vasquez disappeared from the veterinary community 18 months ago, Lucas read from his research. She was involved in a controversial case that ended her career and led to criminal charges being filed. What kind of charges? Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena turned from the window, tears streaming down her face. She could no longer hide behind the false identity that had given her temporary shelter from a past that refused to stay buried. I can explain everything, Elena said, her voice breaking with the weight of 18 months of carefully guarded secrets. Richard studied her face, seeing for the first time the sophisticated intelligence that had been hiding behind the humble facade of a farm worker seeking basic employment. Your real name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, Richard said. It wasn't a question. Elena nodded, her composure finally cracking completely. I graduated from Hartwell Veterinary Institute with the highest honors in the program's history. I was specializing in large animal emergency medicine and had already saved hundreds of animals by the time I was accused of... Her voice trailed off as the memories of her downfall came flooding back. The moment when her entire world had collapsed around her, destroying not just her career but her faith in the justice system she had trusted to protect the innocent. Accused of what? Richard pressed gently, sensing that Elena's story contained depths of tragedy he was only beginning to understand. Negligent malpractice resulting in the death of 12 prize horses, Elena whispered. The owner of Riverside Stables claimed I administered the wrong medication during an emergency call. The horses died, and he sued me for $5 million. Lucas pulled up additional documents. The case made national headlines in the veterinary community. Dr. Vasquez was charged with criminal negligence and lost her license pending investigation. Elena sank into a chair, the weight of her secret finally lifting but bringing with it the crushing pain of reliving her professional destruction. What the news reports didn't mention was that I had been set up by Dr. Marcus Sterling, the stable's primary veterinarian. Set up how? Richard asked, his business instincts recognizing the complexity of corporate sabotage. Dr. Sterling had been embezzling money from the stable's medical budget for months, Elena explained, her voice growing stronger as she finally spoke the truth she had been carrying alone. He was diluting expensive medications and selling the remainder to other practices. When the horses became critically ill from his substandard treatments, he called me for an emergency consultation. The room fell silent as the implications of Elena's revelation sank in. Richard had built his fortune by recognizing deception in business dealings, and something about Elena's story resonated with the ring of truth. He gave me pre-filled syringes that he claimed contained the emergency medication, Elena continued. What I didn't know was that he had filled them with a drug that would interact fatally with the diluted medications already in the horses' systems. Why didn't you defend yourself? Richard asked, genuinely puzzled by Elena's apparent acceptance of blame for someone else's crimes. Elena's expression grew haunted as she revealed the most painful part of her story. Because Dr. Sterling threatened my family. My mother was undergoing experimental cancer treatment that wasn't covered by insurance. He had connections with the pharmaceutical company providing her medication. If I exposed his embezzlement scheme, he would ensure that my mother's treatment was discontinued. The calculated cruelty of Elena's situation hit Richard like a physical blow. She had sacrificed her entire career and reputation to save her mother's life, accepting criminal charges and professional destruction to protect the person she loved most. So, you took the blame to keep your mother alive, Richard said softly. The horses died because of his greed, but I administered the fatal injections, Elena replied. Technically, I was guilty of the charges, even though I had no knowledge of the setup. Lucas looked up from his research with growing concern. Sir, there's more. Dr. Sterling's embezzlement was eventually discovered by federal auditors, but by then Dr. Vasquez had already disappeared. The charges against her were dropped, but her professional reputation was permanently destroyed. Elena wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Even after my name was cleared, no veterinary practice would hire me. The scandal had been too public, and the veterinary community is small. Everyone assumed I was guilty regardless of the legal outcome. "But your mother's treatment?" Richard asked. Elena's face crumpled with fresh grief. "She died anyway, 6 months after I lost my license. The experimental treatment failed, and I wasn't even able to be with her during her final weeks, because I was hiding from the media attention." The tragedy of Elena's story was overwhelming. She had sacrificed everything to save her mother, only to lose both her career and her family in the end. The farm worker seeking basic employment was actually one of the most qualified veterinarians in the country, hiding from a past that had destroyed her, despite her innocence. Richard stood and walked to his window, processing the revelation that the woman who had just saved his livestock operation was the same Dr. Vasquez, whose case had been discussed in agricultural business journals as a cautionary tale about veterinary liability. "Elena," Richard said finally, "or should I call you Dr. Vasquez?" "Elena is fine," she replied quietly. "I haven't felt like Dr. Vasquez for a long time." "The work you did today, saving my bulls, that was the same expertise that made you one of the most respected emergency veterinarians in the country before Sterling destroyed your life." Elena nodded, unable to speak as the emotions of finally sharing her truth overwhelmed her capacity for words. Richard turned back to face her, his expression mixing admiration with determination. "Doctor, Sterling stole 18 months of your life and destroyed your reputation based on lies. What he didn't count on was that the truth has a way of surfacing when people with integrity are involved." "The truth doesn't matter anymore," Elena said bitterly. "My career is over, my mother is gone, and I can barely support my younger siblings on farm worker wages." "Your siblings?" Richard asked, latching on to this new information. "Maria and Carlos. They're living with our aunt now, but she can barely afford to feed them. That's why I need this job so desperately. They're all I have left." Richard exchanged a meaningful look with Lucas, who was already typing notes about Elena's family situation. Richard had built his fortune by identifying exceptional talent and providing opportunities for people to rebuild their lives. "Elena," Richard said with conviction, "what happened to you was criminal, but your story isn't over. You saved my animals today using the same skills that Sterling tried to destroy. Maybe it's time the veterinary community learned what really happened at Riverside Stables." Elena looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Dr. Marcus Sterling's crimes need to be exposed publicly. Your reputation needs to be restored, and your siblings need a guardian who can provide them with the opportunities they deserve." For the first time since her world had collapsed, Elena felt a spark of hope that her nightmare might actually have an ending that didn't involve permanent exile from the profession she loved. 3 days after Elena's revelation, Richard's estate transformed into a command center for what would become the most significant veterinary corruption investigation in decades. Elena sat in the main library, surrounded by boxes of evidence that Lucas had compiled through contacts in law enforcement and regulatory agencies. Dr. Sterling's embezzlement network was far more extensive than anyone realized, Lucas announced, spreading financial documents across the massive oak table. "He wasn't just stealing from Riverside Stables. We found evidence of fraudulent billing at 17 different facilities across 4 states. Elena studied the documentation with growing amazement. The man who had destroyed her life hadn't been content with ruining a single veterinary practice. He had built an entire criminal enterprise based on endangering animals for profit. "The total amount stolen exceeds $2 million, Richard added, reviewing the financial analysis his accounting team had prepared. "But the real tragedy is the number of animals that suffered because of his diluted medications and substandard care." Elena's hand shook as she read through case files describing animals that had died or suffered permanent disability because Sterling had prioritized profit over proper medical treatment. Her own nightmare at Riverside Stables was just one incident in a pattern of systematic abuse that had continued for years. "How many other veterinarians were blamed for his mistakes?" Elena asked, her voice barely audible. "At least 6 that we've identified so far," Lucas replied grimly. "Dr. Sterling was careful to ensure that blame always fell on emergency consultants or temporary staff who couldn't defend themselves effectively. The scope of Sterling's crimes was staggering, But Elena found herself thinking about her siblings, who had been living with their aunt, while she struggled to rebuild her life. Maria and Carlos had endured the loss of their mother, and the disgrace of their sister's supposed malpractice scandal, without understanding the true circumstances behind their family's destruction. "Elena," Richard said gently, "I've been in contact with Judge Patricia Hamilton, who oversees federal veterinary fraud cases. She's agreed to review Sterling's case with new evidence, but she'll need your testimony to establish the pattern of his criminal behavior." Eleanor's response surprised everyone present. "I can't testify against Sterling." "What do you mean?" Richard asked, confusion evident in his voice. "He still has connections in the pharmaceutical industry," Elena explained, her voice filled with fear rather than defiance. "If I testify, he'll destroy what's left of my family. Maria is applying for college scholarships, and Carlos needs specialized art therapy after everything he's witnessed. I won't risk their futures." Richard leaned forward, his expression intense. "Elena, Sterling's network is about to collapse whether you testify or not. The federal investigation has uncovered evidence that doesn't require your participation. But your testimony could ensure that justice is served and your reputation is fully restored." "My reputation is already destroyed," Elena replied bitterly. "Even if Sterling is convicted, people will always associate my name with the Riverside Stables incident." What Elena didn't know was that Isabella Rodriguez, an investigative journalist specializing in agricultural crime, had been monitoring the Sterling investigation and was preparing to publish an explosive exposé that would change public perception of the entire scandal. Isabella had arrived at Willowbrook Estate that morning after Lucas contacted her about Elena's case. She was a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter whose previous work had led to major reforms in agricultural safety regulations. "Dr. Vasquez," Isabella said as she entered the library, "I've spent the last week investigating your case for a feature article about veterinary corruption. What I've discovered is that you're not just innocent of the charges against you. You're actually a hero who sacrificed everything to protect your family." Elena looked up sharply. "I don't want any media attention. I just want to work quietly and support my siblings." "I understand your reluctance," Isabella continued, "but the story I'm writing isn't about your supposed guilt. It's about how Dr. Sterling manipulated the system to destroy innocent veterinarians while continuing his criminal activities." Isabella opened her laptop and showed Elena the preliminary draft of her article. The headline read, "The Veterinarian Who Chose Family Over Career, How Dr. Elena Vasquez Became the Victim of Medical Fraud." "Your story represents everything wrong with how our system treats whistleblowers and innocent professionals," Isabella explained. "By remaining silent, Sterling wins, and other veterinarians remain vulnerable to similar attacks." Elena read through Isabella's article with growing emotion. For the first time since her nightmare began, someone had taken the time to understand the impossible choice she had faced and the courage it had required to sacrifice her career for her mother's life. The article includes testimony from veterinarians across the country who suspected Sterling's practices but were afraid to speak out. Isabella continued, "Your case gave them the courage to come forward with their own experiences." Richard watched Elena processing this information, understanding that she was facing another life-changing decision. The woman who had saved his animals was being offered the chance to save her own reputation and prevent other veterinarians from suffering the same fate she had endured. "There's something else," Lucas added, checking his phone for updates. "Judge Hamilton has issued a federal warrant for Sterling's arrest based on the evidence we've compiled. The pharmaceutical company that threatened your mother's treatment has also been charged with conspiracy and racketeering." Elena's composure finally broke completely as she realized that the nightmare she had been running from was finally ending. The people who had destroyed her life were facing justice, and she no longer had to choose between protecting her family and defending her honor. "Dr. Vasquez," Richard said formally, "I have a proposition for you." Elena looked up through her tears, uncertain what new development was coming. "I want to offer you the position of chief veterinarian for all Blackwood Estate operations, including our breeding programs, agricultural ventures, and animal welfare initiatives. The salary is $300,000 annually, plus full benefits for you and your siblings." The offer was so unexpected that Elena couldn't immediately process its magnitude. A few days earlier, she had been grateful for minimum wage farm work, and now she was being offered a position that would restore not just her financial security, but her professional standing. More importantly, Richard continued, I want to establish the Dr. Elena Vasquez Foundation for Veterinary Ethics and Animal Welfare. The foundation will investigate suspected cases of veterinary fraud and provide legal support for innocent professionals who are falsely accused. Elena stared at Richard in disbelief. You want to name a foundation after me? You represent everything the veterinary profession should aspire to, Richard replied. Integrity, competence, and the courage to do what's right even when the cost is enormous. Isabella leaned forward with excitement. Dr. Vasquez, with your permission, I'd like to make the foundation announcement part of my article. Your story could inspire reforms that protect both animals and the veterinarians who care for them. Elena thought about Maria and Carlos, who had watched their family's reputation destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. Now they could have their sister back, not just as a farm worker hiding from her past, but as a respected professional whose sacrifice had meaning. If I accept, Elena said carefully, I want Sterling's other victims to be part of the foundation. The veterinarians whose careers he destroyed deserve the same chance at redemption that you're offering me. Richard smiled, recognizing the generosity of spirit that had made Elena willing to sacrifice everything for others. That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes you perfect for this position. As the sun set over Willowbrook Estate, Elena finally allowed herself to believe that her story might have a happy ending after all. The farm worker who had arrived desperate for any employment was about to become one of the most respected voices in veterinary medicine. But most importantly, Maria and Carlos would have their sister back, not as a disgraced fugitive from justice, but as a woman whose integrity had ultimately triumphed over corruption and injustice. The transformation was almost complete, but Elena sensed that the most emotional reunion was yet to come. The tranquil morning at Willowbrook Estate shattered when Lucas Reed burst into the library where Elena was reviewing foundation documents with Richard and Isabella Rodriguez. His face was pale with urgency as he clutched his phone with trembling hands. Elena, we have a serious problem, Lucas announced breathlessly. Dr. Sterling knows about the investigation. He's been monitoring our communications through contacts in the pharmaceutical industry. Elena's blood turned cold as the implications hit her. What does that mean? It means he's desperate, Richard said grimly, understanding immediately how cornered criminals behave when their empires begin collapsing. Desperate people make dangerous decisions. Isabella looked up from her laptop where she had been finalizing her explosive article about veterinary corruption. My editor just called. Someone's been threatening the newspaper, trying to stop publication of the Sterling exposé. They're offering bribes and making legal threats. Elena's hands shook as she realized that her nightmare wasn't ending. It was escalating into something far more terrifying than she had ever imagined. Sterling wasn't just going to accept defeat quietly. There's more, Lucas continued, his voice barely steady. Sterling's hired a private investigator to locate your siblings. We intercepted communications indicating he plans to use them as leverage to force you into retracting your cooperation with federal authorities. The room fell into stunned silence as everyone processed the horrifying reality that Elena's family was now in active danger. The same man who had destroyed her career was now targeting innocent teenagers to protect his criminal enterprise. Where are Maria and Carlos now? Richard demanded, immediately shifting into crisis management mode. They're supposed to be at school, but their aunt hasn't been able to reach them since yesterday evening, Lucas replied, checking his phone for updates from the security team Richard had dispatched. Elena collapsed into a chair as the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. She had sacrificed everything to protect her family from Sterling's threats, and now her cooperation with the investigation had put them in even greater danger. This is my fault, Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. I should have stayed hidden. I should never have agreed to testify. Elena, listen to me, Richard said firmly, kneeling beside her chair. Sterling's actions prove that you were right to expose him. He's not just a thief. He's a predator who destroys anyone who threatens his operation. Before Elena could respond, Margaret Thompson appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely controlled panic. Mr. Blackwood, there's a Dr. Marcus Sterling at the front gate demanding to speak with Elena immediately. The blood drained from Elena's face as she realized her tormentor had come to Willowbrook Estate personally. After months of hiding from the man who had destroyed her life, she was about to face him directly. He can't come here. Elena said desperately. You don't understand what he's capable of. Actually, I think it's time we all understood exactly what Dr. Sterling is capable of, Richard replied with steely determination. Margaret, escort Dr. Sterling to the main parlor. Elena, you're not facing him alone. Sterling entered the parlor with the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating his victims into submission. He was a tall man in his 50s, impeccably dressed, with cold eyes that assessed every person in the room as potential obstacles to his objectives. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Sterling said with mock civility. Or should I call you Elena Martinez now? It's amazing how creative people become when they're running from their past. Elena forced herself to meet his gaze, drawing strength from Richard's presence beside her. Dr. Sterling, I'm surprised you'd risk coming here with federal warrants pending against you. Sterling's confident facade flickered momentarily before returning. Warrants based on fabricated evidence and the testimony of disgraced veterinarians aren't worth the paper they're printed on. The evidence includes financial records, witness testimony, and chemical analysis of the medications you diluted, Isabella interjected, her journalist instincts recognizing Sterling's desperation despite his composed exterior. Ah, the media vulture, Sterling sneered. I trust you've been enjoying your little crusade against successful medical professionals. Richard stepped forward, his business experience helping him recognize Sterling's psychological manipulation tactics. Dr. Sterling, what exactly do you want? Sterling's mask dropped completely as he revealed the ruthless calculation behind his polished appearance. I want Dr. Vasquez to publicly retract her accusations and admit that she was solely responsible for the Riverside Stables incident. And if I refuse? Elena asked, though she already knew the answer would involve her siblings. Then Maria and Carlos will discover that their college applications have been mysteriously rejected by every institution they've applied to, Sterling replied with chilling casualness. Amazing how academic records can become corrupted when the right people make the right phone calls. The threat was so precisely calculated that Elena realized Sterling had been planning this confrontation for weeks. He knew exactly which pressure points would force her compliance. You're threatening children to cover up your crimes, Richard said with disgust. I'm protecting my reputation from malicious lies spread by a failed veterinarian who couldn't handle the responsibility of emergency medicine, Sterling shot back. Elena stood up, her fear transforming into righteous anger as she finally confronted the man who had stolen her life. You killed those horses with your greed, and you've been killing animals for years with your fraudulent medications. Prove it, Sterling challenged. Agent Brooks from the Federal Bureau of Investigation would like a word with you about that, a new voice said from the parlor entrance. Agent Jennifer Brooks entered with 2 federal marshals, having been coordinating with Richard's security team to time Sterling's arrest perfectly. She was a seasoned investigator specializing in agricultural crimes. Sterling's composure finally cracked as he realized he had walked directly into a federal trap. You can't prove anything without corrupted evidence and perjured testimony. Actually, we can, Agent Brooks replied, producing an arrest warrant. Your former pharmaceutical contacts have been cooperating with our investigation for weeks. We have recorded conversations, financial transfers, and chemical evidence of your medication tampering going back 5 years. As federal marshals placed Sterling in custody, he turned to Elena with a final desperate threat. This isn't over, Vasquez. You have no idea how many people want to see you destroyed. The only thing being destroyed today is your criminal enterprise, Elena replied with newfound strength. After Sterling was led away, Elena collapsed with relief and exhaustion. The man who had haunted her dreams for 18 months was finally facing justice, but she knew the emotional healing would take much longer. Elena, Agent Brooks said gently, we've located your siblings. They're safe with our protective custody team, but they've been asking for you. Can I see them? Elena asked, her voice breaking with emotion. They're waiting outside, Richard said with a smile. I took the liberty of having them brought here the moment we learned about Sterling's threats. The parlor doors opened, and Maria and Carlos Vasquez rushed in to embrace their sister. Maria was a brilliant teenager with their mother's compassionate eyes, while Carlos was a sensitive artist who had inherited Elena's determination. Elena! Maria cried, throwing her arms around her sister. We were so scared when the federal agents told us someone was trying to hurt you. I'm okay now, Elena whispered, holding both siblings tightly. We're all going to be okay. Carlos pulled back to look at his sister with admiration. The agents told us you're a hero who exposed bad people who were hurting animals. Elena looked around the room at Richard, Isabella, and Agent Brooks. People who had believed in her innocence when she had stopped believing in herself. I'm not a hero, Elena said softly. I'm just someone who finally found the courage to stop running from the truth. Richard stepped forward with documents he had been preparing. Elena, there's one more thing. I've arranged for Maria and Carlos to receive full scholarships to the finest schools in the country, and they'll always have a home here at Willowbrook Estate. As Elena held her siblings and contemplated the future that had seemed impossible just days earlier, she realized that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding our past, but from finding the courage to face it with the support of people who believe in our worth. 1 year later, the grand auditorium at Hartwell Veterinary Institute buzzed with anticipation as hundreds of veterinary professionals, students, and dignitaries gathered for an unprecedented ceremony. Elena stood backstage, wearing the academic regalia that had once seemed lost to her forever, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the Institute's annual Ethics and Excellence Conference. Dr. Vasquez, Dean Patricia Walsh approached with genuine warmth. The auditorium is packed beyond capacity. We have veterinarians attending virtually from 37 countries, all here because of your story. Elena smiled, still adjusting to the restored title that had once defined her identity. A year ago, I was hiding on a farm, convinced my career was permanently destroyed. It's surreal to be standing here. Through the curtain gap, Elena could see the audience that represented her professional vindication. Front row seats were occupied by Maria and Carlos, now thriving in their respective academic programs, flanked by Richard Blackwood and Margaret Thompson, who had become like family to the Vasquez siblings. Ladies and gentlemen, Dean Walsh announced to the packed auditorium, please welcome Dr. Elena Vasquez, Chief Veterinarian of Blackwood Agricultural Enterprises and founder of the Vasquez Foundation for Veterinary Ethics. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes as Elena walked to the podium, her heart filled with gratitude for the journey that had brought her from despair to this moment of professional triumph. 2 years ago, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed auditorium. I made a choice that cost me everything I thought defined my worth. I sacrificed my career, my reputation, and my professional identity to protect someone I loved. The audience listened in rapt attention as Elena shared her story. Not just the facts they had read in Isabella Rodriguez's Pulitzer Prize-winning series about veterinary corruption, but the emotional truth of what it meant to lose everything and find the courage to rebuild. Dr. Marcus Sterling didn't just steal money from veterinary practices, Elena continued. He stole the lives and futures of innocent animals, and he attempted to destroy the careers of honorable veterinarians who posed a threat to his criminal enterprise. In the federal courthouse across town, Judge Patricia Hamilton was delivering Sterling's final sentencing. The disgraced veterinarian had been convicted on 47 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, receiving a sentence of 25 years in federal prison and restitution payments exceeding $3 million. But today isn't about Dr. Sterling's crimes, Elena said, returning the audience's focus to the future rather than the past. Today is about the extraordinary capacity for redemption that exists when people choose integrity over convenience. Elena's eyes found Richard in the audience, the man whose willingness to see beyond appearances had transformed both their lives. Sometimes the most profound growth comes from our darkest moments. The farm where I sought refuge became the place where I rediscovered my purpose. Maria and Carlos beamed with pride as their sister spoke about the foundation that had already provided legal assistance to 12 falsely accused veterinarians and established scholarship programs for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. The Vasquez Foundation operates on a simple principle, Elena explained. Every veterinarian deserves the opportunity to practice with integrity, and every animal deserves care provided by professionals who prioritize healing over profit. In the audience, Michael Chen, a first-year veterinary student whose family could never have afforded his education without foundation assistance, wiped tears from his eyes. Elena's story had inspired him to pursue veterinary medicine despite financial obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. But the most important lesson I've learned, Elena continued, is that our setbacks don't define us. Our responses to those setbacks do. The young woman who asked for farm work at Willowbrook Estate wasn't running from her destiny. She was walking toward it. Elena paused, looking directly at Maria and Carlos. My siblings taught me that protecting the people we love sometimes requires us to lose ourselves temporarily, but real love also requires us to find ourselves again. The audience erupted in applause as Elena concluded her remarks with a challenge that would resonate throughout the veterinary community for years to come. I challenge each of you to look beyond credentials and appearances when evaluating talent. The next breakthrough in veterinary medicine might come from someone working in the humblest circumstances, waiting for someone to recognize their potential. After the ceremony, Elena stood in the Institute's memorial garden with Richard, Maria, and Carlos, reflecting on the extraordinary transformation their lives had undergone. Elena, Maria said, now a pre-med student at prestigious Whitmore University, remember when you used to say that our family's story was a tragedy? I remember, Elena replied, thinking about their mother's death and the years of struggle that had followed. I think our story was actually a love story, Carlos added, his artistic sensibilities allowing him to see beauty in their journey's complexity. A story about how love makes people do impossible things. Richard approached with documents that would finalize the expansion of Willowbrook Estate into a world-class veterinary training facility. Elena, the board has approved funding for the new teaching hospital. We'll be able to train veterinarians in both traditional medicine and ethical leadership. Elena looked around at the memorial garden, where plaques honored veterinarians who had dedicated their lives to animal welfare. Soon, her mother's name would be added to commemorate Rebecca Vasquez's influence on her daughter's commitment to healing. You know what the most beautiful part of this story is? Elena said, her voice filled with wonder at their journey's conclusion. What's that? Richard asked. The humble young woman who asked for farm work at your estate wasn't pretending to be someone she wasn't. She was actually becoming who she was always meant to be. As the sun set over the Veterinary Institute where Elena had once been a promising student and was now a respected leader, she realized that sometimes the greatest victories aren't about reclaiming what we've lost, but about discovering that our losses were actually redirecting us towards something better than we had ever imagined possible. The farm worker who had arrived at Willowbrook Estate with nothing but determination and hidden knowledge had transformed into a voice for justice in the veterinary community. More importantly, she had proven that integrity always triumphs over corruption, and love always finds a way to heal the deepest wounds. Elena's story became legendary in veterinary circles, not as a cautionary tale about professional downfall, but as an inspiring example of how the humblest beginnings can lead to the most extraordinary destinations when courage meets opportunity. The millionaire had indeed done something Elena never imagined when she knocked on his estate gates asking for work. He had given her back her life, her family, and her faith in the power of truth to overcome even the most devastating deceptions. But Elena had given Richard something equally valuable in return. She had reminded him that true wealth comes not from accumulating resources, but from using those resources to lift others from darkness into light. Their story proved that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest acts of human decency, and that the greatest gifts we can offer each other are second chances and the courage to believe in redemption.